Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. My name is Fitria Dianharawati. In this opportunity, I would like to present my article entitled Student Ability in Interpreting Metaphor in Poem and Ocean Memories by Kimberly L. Briones in 6th semester, student of English Department, Pekalongan University. List of content can be seen on the PowerPoint below. Background in the importance of language. Language is an important aspect for human life since language is used to communicate with others. It means that language is an instrument or a medium communication which plays a vital role in human communication. A metaphor is used by someone to express an intention or message to convey to others, but the message cannot be understood directly. Interpreting of poem is one of controversial issues caused by the existing conflict between forms, content, and also high figurative language of poem. Problem statement. There is two problem statement. The first, how is the student ability to interpret metaphor? The second, what are the difficulties faced by students while interpreting metaphor? Significance of the study. Theoretically, the researcher hoped that this research can give reference in the future. Practically, the researcher measured student ability in mastering metaphor in poem. The third, pedagogically, for lecturer, the study is expect to give lecturer new evaluation object and review about meaning of figurative language, especially metaphor, and hopefully the research will give a bit inspiration for lecturer to give the topic in the teaching learning process. For students, the finding of the study expect to give guidance and informative feedback to the student, especially in student of English Education Department, to comprehend the meaning of metaphor. Besides, they could be applied in translating to the make target reader easily and clearly understand the figurative content. Chapter 2, Preview Study. There is 3 previous study from Devi Purwati. The title, An Analysis Student Ability in Translating Business Term from English into Bahasa Indonesia. The second, Tutut Maria Ulfa. The title, The Metaphor Used in Anne Bradstreet Poem. The third, Rizka Hayati, Metafora dalam Ragam Bahasa Puisi. Theoretical review. Metaphor, according Lakoff and Johnson, divide metaphor into 3 types: structural metaphor, orientational metaphor, and ontological metaphor. According to Gerardstein, interpretation by the reader must be mediated by 3 different kinds of mental representation that have to be constructed during reading. Stein called it linguistic. Linguistic discourse function of metaphor is to express meaning. Conceptual discourse function is to embody ideas. Communicative discourse function of metaphor is to convey a message. Chapter 3, Technique of data collection. The researcher used test and interview as instrument. In this research, primary data is taken from result of the test and interview. 2 students in the test. Student had to interpret the metaphor in a poem. After student finished, then the researcher analyzed it. In the interview, researcher will give several questions related to interpretation of metaphor, aimed at getting deeper information about the difficulties in interpreting metaphor in poem. The subject for this research is the chosen 6th semester student of English Department, Pekalongan University. The researcher conducted student in linguistic research class. This is the test was made from the indicator of interpreting by Stein as shown in the table below. Technique of analysis data, there is 4 steps. The first, identification of student interpretation of metaphor in the poem. The second, classification of correct interpretation of metaphor used of student. The third, count the student score by using formula below. The fourth, researcher will interview respondents who score under 60 or grade D to find out more about the difficulties encountered when interpreting metaphors. Finding and discussion. The finding of this analysis were the average score of the student ability in interpreting metaphor was 64 or C plus grade. It means that students were good enough to identifying the metaphor expression, conceptual function, and communicative function. The distribution of grades were as follows. Can seen in the PowerPoint. According to the table indicator of interpreting metaphor by Gerard Steen, there are 3 indicators. The first, identifying the metaphor expression. The researcher conclude the most of students can mention the metaphor that contained in the poem. Conceptual function, the researcher conclude the students have difficulty to describe the meaning of metaphor and how this relate to the feeling of the poem. Communicative function, the most of the students can give their opinion about moral message contained in the poem because it depends on the views, feelings, and understanding of each individual. Discussion, ability in interpreting metaphor. The student ability in interpreting metaphor. Based on data obtained that 23 out of 24 students can mention 7 metaphors contained in the poem. Based on the finding above, the statement used a metaphor to imply that a majority of the students understand the concept of metaphor. B. Student ability in understanding meaning metaphor. Researchers found that students can give meaning to the metaphor they have identified with various findings, such as students can describe the meaning of the metaphor in poetry well as this relates to feeling of the poem. C. Student ability in understanding communicative function. Based on the research analysis, students cannot connect the meaning of each word in the poem because poetry is unique. The sentence becomes support between other sentences. Students cannot grasp the meaning conveyed by the author of the poem, so they cannot give moral value to the poem. Difficulties in interpreting metaphor. A. Student difficulties in identifying metaphor. Based on the result interview, student one metaphor proved difficult to interpret was I am an old ship. The confusion arose because the metaphor can be understood in different ways. B. Student difficulties in understanding meaning of metaphor. In this level, difficulties to understanding meaning because they don't know the vocabulary and they don't know the similarities of this metaphor in Indonesia. C. Student difficulties in understanding communicative function. In this level, student difficulties to understanding communicative function. Student cannot understand the message conveyed by the author and make connection between the verses of the poem to extract the correct moral value. Chapter 5, Conclusion and Suggestion. Conclusion, the researcher conclude that student ability in interpreting metaphor, 63% of students successfully passed the test. This conclusion is drawn because more than 50% of the students received grades that are considered passing grades. A mean B plus, B mean and C plus. Second, the student difficulty in interpreting metaphor were the student difficulties in conveying the meaning of the word metaphor because of limited vocabulary and determining metaphorical sentences contained in the poem. Suggestion for student. It's important for students to understand more about metaphor, since understanding a poem cannot be separated from figurative language. The students 6th semester of English Department Pekalongan University have to increase their effort in learning and reading of literary work to solve their obstacles in interpreting of metaphor among them. For the lecturer should make the student more interested to make a poem and interpret a poem, with give many exercise to interpret metaphor of poem. For other researcher, this research can provide other researcher the data of metaphorical expression inside the poem of Kimberly L. Bryons. There's enough from me. Thank you. Sorry if another mistake. Wassalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh.